So what's the latest thing to disrupt the app ecosystem? It's the web. And today in this video, I'm going to show you what a progressive web application is and give you some good fodder for why progressive web apps are going to change the way you think about mobile and native applications. Hey guys, Chris Love, the owner of Love to Dev and a progressive web application fanatic. Now, if you haven't heard of progressive web apps, these are just websites that took the right vitamins and progressively become apps. That's right. These are websites that look and behave like a regular native application and are benefited by the great features that are offered by some of the new platform capabilities that help them rival native applications without losing their rich web capabilities of reach and engagement. So sit back, relax, and I've got a great presentation that we're going to walk through to give you a high-level overview of all the great things about progressive web apps and why they're probably the better solution for your app needs.
Thanks for joining me for this presentation on progressive web applications and how they're going to be able to disrupt the application ecosystem. And if you haven't heard of progressive web applications, this is going to be a great presentation for you to watch and learn. If you have heard of progressive web applications, maybe you need some extra resources to help you sell the concept to your team members and stakeholders. Again, another great reason to watch this video. Or maybe you just want to know more about progressive web apps in general. Going to have a lot of information here, and I'd love your feedback. So with that, let's just get started with a little bit of paperwork here, so to speak. A little bit about who I am. If I can get the slides to move. There we go. All right, so I am Chris Love. I am the owner of Love to Dev, and basically I try to tell people that I live in the browser and focus on front-end web development, but I do have a background essentially doing full stack stuff, but if things have gotten more complicated, I have migrated to the front end. That doesn't mean I don't do some back-end stuff. I am actually pretty bullish and excited and have fun doing serverless architecture stuff as well. It's just not my primary focus. Now, if you want to go to our YouTube channel, there's a little bit.ly there for you. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you're already there. I do encourage you to subscribe to the channel. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I like to share a lot of resources around web development, especially around progressive web apps and web performance optimization. And you can follow me at Chris Love, and love to have you do that. If you want to drop me a note, ask me some questions directly, feel free. My email is chris@lovetodev.com, and that is my personal email address. And the website, of course, is lovetodev.com. And you know, that was the kind of the professional photo of me, but what I like to do in real life is run Spartan races. And that's one of my favorite photos of me finishing up a race up in Tuxedo, New York last summer. And that's what I do for fun. So if you're into fitness and you're into Spartan racing, maybe we can meet up together at a race and enjoy some fun together outside of this development world. Okay, so as we get into this progressive web application thing, I think it's important to understand why progressive web apps are important and why this is the direction you need to take your website. And to me, the biggest reason is because HTML and the web in general ultimately fell short when it comes to user expectations. And when I talk about this, primarily those user expectations really started changing almost around a decade ago when Apple released that iPhone. Right about that point is where the web truly had won over the desktop as the preferred way to deliver content and build front-end user experiences. And that was because you could build the web and it would work in different browsers across different platforms. But at the time, honestly, we had kind of a minimal amount of constraints that we had to worry about. And when I'm talking about that, we're talking about viewports and what I would say input modalities. Back then we had keyboards, mouse, and the general resolution was 1024 by 768. But I think at that point we were just starting to get to say 1200 by 900 as far as screen resolutions. But in general, we didn't have to worry about too much at that point. So things like responsive design weren't important. Everybody in at least the developed world was getting online using high-speed internet, primarily fixed wire and Wi-Fi. And so bandwidth wasn't necessarily a concern at that point. But since then, everything's kind of flipped around. Today, the predominant means that people get on the internet is through mobile devices, and at least 25% of the time, according to analyst, that means they're connecting over cellular connections, which is GPRS. That means LTE, 4G, 3G, and sometimes even worse. The other side of it is instead of those great processors in our laptops and desktop machines, most people are connecting using their phones, which are lower power devices and just don't have the amount of resources and horsepower that we experience on desktops. And as developers, we're generally on those desktops making those experiences, and that can lead to some other uh, undesired ramifications when we actually ship to production because we haven't properly tested. But at the same time, does HTML5 really meet the needs that people are expecting? And so let's talk a little bit about how the web's fallen short. Now, in my opinion, HTML5 has a big perception problem. It's perceived as slow. I hear this a lot, and honestly, I know it's not slow because I love to specialize in what's called web performance optimization. And I've got a whole series of content around web performance optimization, tips, tricks, etc., that will help you make your sites run extremely fast. And one of the things that I see is most websites don't adhere to these what I would consider cardinal rules or best practices of web development to deliver well-performing websites, and that has caused the web to be extremely slow. I'll give you a stunning stat. The average web page takes at least 20 seconds to load on mobile phones. And today, mobile devices account for up to 95% or more of the traffic to every website. In fact, recently I was talking to a lead engineer for a major US retailer, and if I said the retailer's name, you would probably recognize it, and he told me that 95% of their website traffic came from just iPhones. Let that sink in a bit for you. A major US retailer, 95% of their website traffic comes from an iPhone. Not a desktop, not even an Android, an iPhone. Now that's a huge market share. That means they could almost ignore desktop altogether. But that also creates a lot of unique situations where performance needs to be minded. Now, the other thing is that the web is perceived to be lacking capabilities. And I find this very unfortunate as I go out and interact with developers. I work with clients. I talk to their developers. I talk to developers at events around the country. And it seems like most web developers don't really know what the web can do. And I find this very unfortunate because the web can do some amazing things. And for example, I still think a lot of developers don't realize there's a geolocation API that's been available for over a decade across all browsers. This means you don't have to do any kind of server-side location detection. You can do it right there in the browser with the user's permission. And this gives you all kinds of great, powerful capabilities, especially when it comes to retail, when you've got local retail that you need to manage. And another one is that it's been incapable of working offline. And this has been untrue, again, for about a decade. Back then, the app cache manifest specification was introduced, and that ushered in the era of when we could make sites work offline. The big problem with app cache is it's not the easiest thing to work with as far as the development and DevOps side, and that's led to a lot of confusion. But I think even more is the fact that probably the vast majority of developers out there are not even aware of its existence. And this is unfortunate because I've been able to leverage just having an app cache manifest as a mechanism to make my web applications work offline. Now, I like to point out this article because back at TechCrunch in 2012, Mark Zuckerberg said that their biggest mistake was betting too much on HTML5. And I found this very disappointing, especially seeing where Facebook has gone. Facebook has basically gone the path of creating a custom browser with a closed content ecosystem. Essentially, they created their own private internet effectively. And what they did at this point, and I think this is a critical point in Facebook's life cycle, is they essentially turned their nose up at HTML5, went to the native app platform, and decided to essentially wall off all the Facebook content from the rest of the world. And I won't get into the details and technicalities of that, but you can see that that's how they went about doing it. In fact, they even created their own markup language called JSX, which honestly I personally hate. And this is a language that mixes three different major concerns: JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, and puts them all into one file format. And I think this leads to a lot of confusion and a lot of unnecessary work that we as developers have to do. Now, I know React is super popular, but I am so not a fan of React because of that. But I'm not going to get into that today. This is not here to discuss the merits or negatives of any kind of framework or approach to actually producing your content. I want to focus on why progressive web apps are awesome. But at this point, well, let's just talk about that. So that's just it. They looked at it and said, I don't think we can trust that the web is going to basically roll or mature fast enough for us for it to keep up with our growth plans, our growth strategies. And so they went a different direction, essentially went off and crafted their own web where they can control everything from end to end. And that's one of the things that I think is unique about the web, is the only thing we really control is what we have on the server. Once it gets requested and the browser on the client side actually returns it, we don't have any control, because we don't have control over the browser, we don't have control over their device, we don't have control over their operating system. So it's kind of the wild, wild west out there. Fortunately, we have things called web standards, and as developers, we need to program to those standards. Unfortunately, at that point, web standards weren't as mature as they are today, and we've come a long way in the last 5 years. But at the same time, there was a lot of things that, as I analyzed Facebook at that time, I saw them missing big time, and just a flat out, in my opinion, misunderstanding of what was available to them at the time. And it was very frustrating to me. So with that, I think that's just one of those big examples of how the web was completely misunderstood and underutilized, so to speak. And I don't want you to be making those mistakes, especially with the capabilities that we have today. So let's look at the perception problem in a different light. Now, the common thread, I guess, is that most developers and stakeholders perceive this graph as being true, where native apps for devices like the Apple iPhone, iPad, Android devices, and Windows with a desktop, native applications give you a lot more capability. They're more tightly integrated into the platform. They have the ability to do offline, although I rarely ever see a native application actually work offline. And they have the ability to do things like push notifications when a user doesn't even have the application loaded. And so that's a clear advantage that native applications have. But the web, on the other hand, is much easier to reach to people. And as we go through this presentation, I'll talk about some of what that really means and how we can actually reach people. But really, it comes down to links. The ability to link or deep link to content is the web's superpower. It allows us to, as marketers or brand managers and business owners, to directly drive traffic to specific landing pages where we can funnel visitors into our sales funnel, so that we can ultimately build that relationship where we've got a profitable relationship where we can provide goods and services for customers at a profitable margin. And that's what everybody wants. It's much harder to do that with a native application. In fact, it's much harder to get people to even download your native application. So here's why HTML ultimately has fallen short. So some of it's technical, and one of the first things is browsers are single-threaded. And what that really means is that all the JavaScript you're loading, all the CSS, they're all handled by the same thread. And if you understand threading models, which basically any developer should, you understand that there's only one task that can be done at a single time. And when you've got a lot of JavaScript being loaded and you've got a lot of CSS being loaded, the browser can't finish that, what we call the critical rendering path, and actually render the markup. How many times have you gone to a website, loaded that page, and then it flashes and reloads all over again, and maybe you've scrolled down the page a little bit and all of a sudden you're back at the top? Or maybe it's hung and you can't even scroll or click the link that you're looking for. And that's because there's a ton of JavaScript being loaded. There's a lot of CSS that's required to render. And in most cases, upwards of 99% of that code is never even used. And that means that you've got to sit there and wait. And this is a huge reason. This is probably the number one reason why it takes 20 seconds for the average web page to load these days. And that's just it. It leads to performance issues, and that's frustrating. And this is the number one point of frustration for end users when web pages take too long to load. They just want that instantaneous experience. That instantaneous experience, you want to be at 1 second or less if possible, but at 3 seconds, you've already lost half the people that tried to load that web page. So you've got 3 seconds to load. And over a mobile phone on a cellular network, that makes a lot of constraints that you need to actually design your experience to work under. And another one is what I've kind of alluded to, the lack of platform level API access, deep integration into the hardware. And this can mean a lot of different things. But to be honest, most web pages, most web applications out there don't necessarily integrate too deeply into the platform. Uh, but they do need to sometimes interact directly with the hardware. But those are, in my opinion, really edge cases. But then there's things where, like I mentioned, geolocation is something where you're going to integrate in with the platform. And you want to be able to do that in a lot of cases. Maybe you need to play audio or video. Again, those are actually leveraging platform level things. And the web's got great multimedia capabilities with the audio and video tag these days. And then you've got things like the media capture and WebRTC APIs that bring that kind of stuff to a whole nother level. Now, a lot of the reason why we couldn't get platform access is because of security concerns. Essentially, the browser vendors have been debating what's the best way for us to provide access to these hardware features. Because the tighter or the more we give developers and brands the ability to integrate into our platform, they're also integrated into our customers' privacy. And that can open up security holes that we're not necessarily comfortable allowing to get open. And honestly, the native applications have had different ways of going about doing it, and effectively they're fleshing out some of those issues for us to determine kind of what works best at this point. And as those things have kind of gone through that A/B testing cycle, if you will, now we're able to have a clearer model or pattern for browsers to agree upon so that standards can be made so that now we can have a kind of a permission-based pattern to this. And it really boils down a lot of times to this. Make sure your site is being served over HTTPS, one of the key tenets of being a progressive web application. And I'll talk about that more later on. So now that you've got a secure connection, at that point, then ask the user's permission to be able to integrate with that platform feature and enable it. And if honestly, if that's not essentially good enough for that particular platform feature, then maybe you do need to kind of go the mobile native application route. In fact, Microsoft is upgrading all progressive web apps to full-blown native applications on the Windows platform if you go through the Windows Store. And if you go through that effort and people install your progressive web app from the Windows Store, then you have full platform access, just like any other native application. You're on equal standing with UWP applications. And that's a very key advantage that you can have on the Windows platform. And again, that single-threaded model. How do we get around this single-threaded model so that we can get better performance? And the next thing, dealing with that developer lack of awareness, we need to get better developer education about what's available on the platform, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this particular presentation, so that you'll be better exposed to what's available on the platform. And I also want to help you implement better user experience. And this can mean a lot of things, and I'm not really going to be able to get into kind of UX kind of things or best practices in this particular presentation, but know that a lot of it comes down to that performance stuff, but also how you design navigation, input modalities, all these kind of things. You've got to design and craft a great, seamless user experience that just makes people feel comfortable with your brand. And from a technical point of view, a great example of this that I see missed all the time is developers are trying to use JavaScript to do animations. JavaScript is the worst choice you can make for driving animations. Instead, you need to understand how to use CSS to do animations, how to do keyframe animations, transitions, all these kind of things. CSS works great for this, and it uses the GPU, whereas JavaScript uses timers, and those are extremely inefficient. Again, not going to have time to cover that in this presentation, but I want to plant that seed in your head, and in the near future, we'll try to do some content around that as well. Now, more about how we fell short. I think this is another technical reason, is the inability to explain HTTP caching and high-level HTTP interactions like the HTML5 app cache. And this is where diving deep into service workers, service worker caching, and managing those assets that are cached is very important, and it's also a very confusing topic. I would say it's a more advanced topic, but I think the average web developer has very little concept of how HTTP caching works, things understanding the cache control header. And I think a lot of DevOps teams often overlook this as well, and we see a lot of problems with that. If you look at the HTTP archive, they track who actually uses proper cache headers, and usually it's somewhere under the 60% range, which I think is very sad, because this is a very key part of making your website work more efficiently. And this ultimately leads to the difficulty in building an offline first web application, kind of what I call a natural way, meaning it's just a normal developer and deployment workflow is making sure that your web application can work offline. And obviously this is where service workers can be super valuable, but we've got the ability to do that even if service workers aren't supported. But because we don't really have an offline first approach to our normal development cycle, this is often overlooked, and this leads to what I consider poor quality user experiences. And another thing that the web has not had until service workers came along was the ability to execute things in the background. And service workers are fantastic for this because they work in a separate thread in a separate context from the browser, and this allows you to do many things that either really slow down your user experience or clog up your server, so to speak. And I'll talk about that in my course quite a bit, is how to leverage service workers to do things that you've been doing maybe through the front end or maybe on your server, and now you can maybe push that off to the service worker level and improve your overall experience. So now we talked a little bit about how the web has kind of fallen short. I want to talk to you a little bit about what is a progressive web application and how does a progressive web app actually kind of change the way we can approach the web to kind of counterbalance or counteract or eliminate some of those issues that I brought up in the first section of how the web has fallen short. And if you want it, I've got a free ebook available for you that goes through what is a progressive web app, essentially why you should upgrade. And that's at lovetodev.com/PWA upgrade. All you got to do is submit your email and I'll send you information on how to download that free ebook. Now, the web or the progressive web apps, I think the best way to explain them is this quote: a new way to deliver amazing user experiences on the web. And That's because progressive web apps really bring together best practices for delivering websites and also bring in brand new technologies, features that the web now supports. And combining those together gives us the ability to deliver great user experiences. And that's ultimately about what all of this concerns, great user experiences. Now, the great thing about a progressive web app is it doesn't need to be maintained separately from a native application. It can completely replace that application experience. In fact, that is what Twitter is in the process of doing. If you haven't heard, back in April of 2017, Twitter released a new progressive web app called Twitter Lite. And it is almost a one-for-one parody of Twitter on the phone with when I say parody, with their existing native application. And that's because the web has all the capabilities that Twitter needs to provide the Twitter experience. There's nothing that Twitter doesn't have access to that they need to drive everything that you would want to do with Twitter. Post tweets, upload live videos, photos, all kinds of stuff. Background push notifications, all the stuff that you're used to getting from, say, the desktop or the native application, you can do through Twitter Lite. And that's just a great example of how you can phase out any native application concerns and trim your essentially your whole technology budget for having to maintain different applications and pour that into progressive web applications and deliver a much better experience. And progressive web apps, basically this is a new level of quality, and because you've got this new level of quality, this new level of experience, you can ultimately earn a place on the user's home screen. And this is one of the clear advantages that native applications have had, because when you've reached that point where the customer is willing to go through all the steps necessary to download your native application from the platform's application store, your icon is now sitting on that desktop. And that icon on their desktop or their home screen represents a unique bond where they like your brand enough to make it part of their day-to-day experience. Even if they don't open your application, your brand logo is sitting there on their home screen, reminding them of who you are and reminding them of that relationship that you have with them. It also means that you need to deliver and consistently maintain a good user and business experience so that they don't look at that icon and go, oh, I don't know about that anymore, and maybe knock you off. And it takes a lot to earn that spot on their home screen, even if you're a native application. But this is exactly what progressive web applications can do. They can earn that place on their home screen, and they'll be much more inclined to open up and view your content. Now, progressive web apps have three really key attributes, and the first one that I've talked about several times already is they're fast. They respond quickly to the user. That means they load fast. They respond quickly to user inputs and expectations. And that's because you followed web development best practices. And when you do that, you can have basically an instant load experience for your website. And that's one of the first tangible qualities of a progressive web application. Next, it needs to be reliable. It means the user knows that when they launch your application, it's just going to work. And to do that, it needs to be able to work offline and when they've got poor connectivity. And as you go through, especially in my course, you're going to learn that essentially you're building your website, your web application to work without the network. You're building a offline first, mobile first web experience when you build a proper progressive web application. And when you do that, the network honestly should not matter for the most part. Now, there's obviously cases where you need to get live data off the internet, but the great thing is when you've got a service worker in place, you've got a good strategy for dealing with those offline and poor connectivity cases. Next, it needs to be engaging. It needs to have this immersive user experience. And this is what I call those esoteric areas. This is where kind of you get into more user experience and artistic side of things, but there are also technical things that you can manage as well, like having good navigation patterns, and again, just having a good experience all around. And this is where doing things like, not overloading the site with JavaScript and unnecessary CSS are good. Having a good plan for how you're going to cache your assets offline so that you can get quick, snappy transitions and many other kind of things. But it's also about having that home screen experience and earning that spot there and maintaining a good relationship at that point. And it's also about being able to use things like push notifications so that you can touch those people, or what we call interruption marketing in other places, to remind them of things about your brand. And this is very, very important. And this is another key advantage that progressive web applications have over our traditional websites. Now, I've already mentioned this quote, but I want to give credit to where it's due, and that's Chris Wilson of the Chrome team. And basically, he said in one of the videos that they shared at one of their conferences, progressive web applications, a new level of thinking about the quality of your user experience. And this is the thing. When I say that HTML fell short, it's because I don't think we really approached HTML on the web thinking about it with a good quality of user experience. And the whole push behind progressive web apps is to push the web to have better user experiences. Alex Russell, this is the dude that actually came up with the term progressive web app. Okay, he also works for the Chrome team, and I love this quote because this really says exactly from a technical side of things what a progressive web app is. These apps aren't packaged and deployed through stores. They're just websites that took the right vitamins and they progressively become apps. And that's because the progressive web app means that you can add all of the support for all these brand new features. And even if the browser itself doesn't yet support some of these features, your website will still just work. And also because you have followed these web development best practices, your website's going to work really, really well. Now we're going to see later when I talk about some of the case studies how adopting proper progressive web application stuff has benefited many businesses on iOS, which right now doesn't have Service Worker or App Manifest support. But because they followed better web development practices, their business metrics have increased significantly. Now, Bruce Lawson, he used to be the head of Opera, which is a very popular browser, especially in the developing world. And I love what he said about this, that native apps are a bridging technology like Flash. And I think this is a very bold statement for Bruce to say, but I wholeheartedly support and understand this, and I think he's 100% on point when he says this. Remember when I said that the web essentially finally took over and owned the desktop back around 2007? And that's because we finally kind of figured out what does it really mean to build a good user experience on the desktop. And we had that limited constraints of viewports, and we had a pretty good idea what the platform was going to be like. And then all of a sudden the phone came out. And just like the desktop, it just went faster, right? Instead of 20 years, we went into a less than 10-year cycle on this one, where native apps kind of gave us the guidelines of what a good user experience should be like on these brand new mobile platforms. And one of the things that we did along the way too, to make the web kind of work like those desktop applications, is we used Flash, because Flash gave us a more controllable platform to kind of build higher end user experiences. But as we know now, Flash is being completely deprecated. Adobe's killing it off, and browsers are rapidly removing support for it. In fact, right now, I don't think there's really any browser that really wants to support Flash, and it's very limited when it is. And the thing about Flash was it kind of gave us a way to kind of see what might actually work on the web. And a lot of the things that Flash, and if you think about it, XAML as well, have led us to craft specifications and standards like the CSS grid, for example, in web animations, and the multimedia elements that I talked about earlier. It kind of gave us a roadmap for how these things needed to be implemented to be successful on the web, and that's exactly what's gone on. Progressive web applications are going to replace native applications because they're just cheaper to develop, they're cheaper to deploy, and they're much, much smaller, which means the user has more room on their small device, and so many other great capabilities around them. Ultimately, anything you deliver as far as a user experience is about what the customer wants. And customers want applications that work offline, that load instantly, and have easy navigation and visual cues. This is all about that user experience. They want to basically not have to fuss with, they don't want to have to wait on your application to respond. They just want it to work. I hear that so much when I talk to what I call normal people. They just want things to work and they don't want to have to get frustrated waiting on things to work. And if you follow best practices, more often than not, you're going to have that just work experience. But also from a developer's point of view, it's about what stakeholders want, the people who actually pay us to develop these experiences. They want platform integration. They want to appear on the user's home screen, and they want to have those things push notifications. I can't tell you how many clients and potential clients have asked me over the last decade, how can I do native push notifications on the web? And this has frustrated me because I've lost out to a few projects in favor of native applications because they simply wanted push notifications. Now, often, they didn't even have a strategy for how they were going to use them. They just said they wanted them. And push notifications are really awesome. They're a way to re-engage your customer. And the great thing about it is now we've got the ability to do native push notifications on the web. And like I said, we've got better platform integrations. We've got more and more APIs to give us access to some of the deeper things in there. And I've talked about things like geolocation, multimedia, but we've also got new APIs emerging around social sharing, email integration, and all kinds of other platform capabilities. And of course, that coveted place on the user's home screen or start menu, if you will. And that's ultimately what all of our efforts are really about. Now, everything works great when we've got great connectivity. And you look at your phone and you see those 5 bars. You just know you don't have to worry about the connectivity. It just works. And often here in the United States, if you've got an LTE network, you're in pretty good shape for that. But I can attest that it's not always the case. Often, even around me in a very developed suburban world, I get 1 bar or less on my phone, and the connectivity goes to pot. That's right. It just frustrates you as you wait on things. But what's even worse is you get no bars. And for some reason, there's several Italian restaurants near me where when you go inside, there's absolutely zero cell coverage. And it's very frustrating because nothing works at that point. I get no Twitter updates, no Facebook updates. What am I going to do at dinner except talk to the people around me? Anyway, I digress. No bars is very frustrating because now basically nothing on the web really works unless you built your site to work offline. But the worst case, the absolute worst case, is what we call Li-Fi. That's when you've got those 5 bars, but there's something between your phone and the internet that's broken, and your connectivity to the internet does not exist. And essentially what's going on is you've connected to the cell tower, but the cell tower from there to the internet is not getting you connected to the actual internet. And this is so frustrating because you're like, I don't know why. And the average person probably just assumes that your website is down. And this is bad. We don't want that. But if you build your progressive web application and use service workers correctly, the state of the network really doesn't matter. And ultimately, in the end, your app must be able to handle any kind of offline situation. The network should be a progressive enhancement, not a necessary requirement for most applications. Now, obviously, there are edge cases or different, I don't say necessarily edge cases, but there are many application scenarios that probably do need to be connected to really be used to the fullest. I've mentioned Twitter. Obviously, I can't get any new Twitter updates if I'm not connected, but I could still queue up tweets and have those go out when I do get back online. And there's ways to do that with service workers if background support is supported, or maybe you can even kind of polyfill that on your own. And even if you don't have service workers, there's ways to get around that and work that up as well. And think about Pokemon Go. Could Pokemon Go work if it was offline? Or what if the internet connectivity was spotty? Could you still make Pokemon Go work? I absolutely believe you could, because I know a little bit about how it worked because I essentially reverse engineered it to a large degree. And I know that the little critters that spawn, your phone actually knows about a lot of them. They're in your general radius around you. So you could actually make it work even if you had spotty internet connectivity. And so things like Pokemon Go, perfect candidates for progressive web applications. But progressive web applications offer an opportunity for us to upgrade the tech stack. Now, I've mentioned App Cache. Now, App Cache is in the process of being deprecated by browsers. But for now, for browsers that don't support service workers, like Apple Safari and Internet Explorer, App Cache is supported. But in most cases, you want to actually use a service worker. The great thing is you can use both. And I'll talk about that in my course, why that's the case. But basically, if you register a service worker and the service worker is supported, the browser will defer to it for offline capabilities. But if the browser doesn't support service workers, you're not going to have the registered service worker, but you can still reference an app cache manifest and it will work just like it has in the past. Now, another thing is I've used local storage quite a bit over the last decade to store content. And this was my original persistence layer for storing offline content was in local storage. But as IndexedDB achieved ubiquitous support by all browsers, I've been migrating away from local storage for most of that. And so most of my data persistence now is done in IndexedDB instead. Another thing, Apple has, since the announcement and release of the original iPhone, had a specification for touch icons. This is how you tell iOS Safari how to add your website to the home screen and put your icon there and what the launch experience should be like. Instead, that's done with a lot of meta tags in your document head, but that's being replaced in favor of a web manifest, which we'll talk about later on. And now you've got a more integrated add to home screen experience because the browsers will now either pop up an install banner or give you visual cues to tell you that you can add a progressive web app to the home screen. Where in the past you would have to manually do this with something like cubic.org's add to home screen library. So now you can safely migrate yourself away from these solutions. Again, let me remind you that progressive web apps need to operate fast, they need to engage customers, and I want to emphasize this too. To properly build a progressive web app, you need to build them very differently from the way you've built websites in the past. Now, this is a little rundown of kind of some of the reasons what a progressive web app is and some of the advantages of a progressive web app. Now let's actually look at how this compares to native applications. Now this is what I call the app smackdown. This is where I go through and compare native applications to progressive web apps and kind of set up what the reality is. What are industry and analysts finding that real users do and want? Now, here are real stats. Now these are aged a little bit. This is from 2015, and granted you're not going to have a lot of 2017 stats just yet. But at that point, there's a lot of analysis going on around apps. This is because businesses are trying to figure out, should I ship an app or not, basically. And if you look at it, the mobile web accounts for about 13% of mobile screen time, and native apps account for 87% of mobile screen time. So if you just look at that stat alone or that comparison, there's no reason for you to bother with the web, right? Just build a native app because that's the only way you're going to actually get anybody to ever do anything with your brand. But if you dive deeper into it, out of that 87%, 80% of it is spent in the user's top 3 applications. Now, what are those top 3 applications? Well, let's just say it's Facebook, okay? And back in 2015, the reality was being passed around that we have passed peak app. This is the point where application um, or native apps basically are just not wanted anymore, and users are kind of abandoning them. So the effort and response and effort to, or the effort and investment in those platforms really is not going to yield you the returns that you need or expect. And here's one of the bigger telling stats. The number of apps that the average user downloads in a given month is 0. Now you may be saying, no, this is not true. This is reality. This is what real users actually do. And when I talk to my friends that are not technical or not developers, and I just say, how many apps have you downloaded this in the last month or the last 3 months? The answer is, wait a minute, I haven't downloaded an app in a long time. Unless it's their kids that are playing with their phones, and then they're constantly downloading free little games. That's about it. That's about the only downloads that people really have. The only time that people tend to download new applications or just download apps is when they get a brand new phone and they have to download all the apps that they've already downloaded. And usually this is done automatically when you upgrade your phone. So that's not a good story when it comes to native applications. And one of the reasons why people don't install apps is, this is what they've actually told us, is that they get a little turned off by the overbroad permission demands up front. This means when you go through the download from the App Store, you go through this step where it goes, okay, this app needs these permissions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it freaks out a lot of people because they don't necessarily know what it is. To them, it's almost like reading the tax code. It's scary, and they want help. And if it's too much effort and it's too much friction, they just don't bother. Another reason, native apps are huge. They are massive in size, and disk space on phones is very limited. And honestly, most people want to be able to do one of 3 things predominantly on their phones these days. If you're like me, you want to listen to music, and podcasts, and audio books. That's a big chunk of what's on my phone. The other thing that's on my phone that everybody else seems to be interested in is their personal photos and videos. Okay, that's what people really want to use the disk space for on their phones. Instead of a bunch of apps. I very rarely talk to a friend who has more than a dozen or 2 apps that they've even downloaded that weren't there by default. Another concern that they have, because they read headlines and they don't necessarily understand them, is privacy concerns. They don't necessarily trust these applications, and they don't trust that they're safe from hackers, because they do read a lot about hackers and viruses attacking these mobile platforms today, especially on Android. And that can be very scary as well. Now remember, this is what's always the true. The web is the #1 places customers discover and interact with new things. They're constantly searching for stuff, and today, personal assistants like the Google Play Assistant, Cortana, and Siri are how we find things to begin with, and those are all based on web searches. So when you ask your phone, find me jeans around me, or find that Italian restaurant near me, what it's doing is it's hitting their search engine and it's giving you the results from the search engine. And those links are going to take you to websites pretty much all the time. So again, the web is how you get discovered. And people are constantly looking for what we call long tail phrases. And if your website is ranked well enough for those long tail phrases, the odds of them finding you and choosing you are much higher. You can't really do that with a native application because content in native applications really is not indexable and it's not directly linkable, at least for the most part. So this is where the web has a very clear advantage over native. But what about actually earning a customer? If you're a developer, you may not know what it takes to market to get people to interact with those interfaces or experiences that you're building. But it ultimately comes down to money, advertising and marketing money to get people to pay attention to your brand. So what does that cost? Now these numbers are a little bit dated. Some of the newer numbers that I've looked at are even higher. So it costs between $1 to $2.50 for an interaction to possibly even get somebody to download your mobile application. But to actually get somebody to really use your app on iOS, you're looking at nearly $8. On Android, over $2. Some of the recent numbers I've even seen around these loyal user numbers is on iOS today. Sometimes the number I see, the average number I see, is upwards of $15 to actually get a real customer for your application. Android's not quite as bad. I've seen between $2.50 and $5. But I'm referencing these because I've got a good link to that to those numbers. But in general, it's much, much higher. Now you compare that to what it costs to get traffic to your website through what we call a pay-per-click campaign, like Google AdWords or Bing's pay-per-click traffic, or even Facebook. You're looking at pennies. Most of the traffic I can drive to my content is costing me between zero point 0.4 cents and 7 cents a visitor. It just depends on how well targeted things are and other factors when it comes to marketing. But compared to $1 to $2.50 to get somebody to even consider downloading your application, to drive for pennies people to come visit my content is so much cheaper. And I have to develop the same kind of marketing or front end materials like video promos or banner ads and things like that, or come up with pay-per-click ads, the same kind of stuff that I would have to for a native application, but it's so much cheaper to get people to visit those pages and videos and things like that. In fact, like the one you're watching right now. And here's another big thing. Now this is an actual graphic that I pulled from some of the Chrome team's presentations where they were comparing side by side web apps to their native counterparts. And the ones on the left are regular native apps for Android, and the ones on the right are their web counterparts. And as you can see, the web counterparts take up less than a megabyte of space on the device, whereas the native ones take up 460 megs. On iOS, the numbers are even worse because iOS applications are much larger in size than Android apps. So this is another big factor of will people even keep your icon on their home screen? If they don't visit you regularly, then most likely they're going to delete that application in favor of storing videos and photos that they're taking on their phone. Trust me, I know that's true. So let's go back to our capability and reach graphic. Now, we've already established that native apps are perceived to have more capabilities, but the web has much better reach. So who really has the clear advantage here? Well, remember, apps are things you want to invest in and not one-off experiences. The web tends to be a one-off experience. But if you can provide a good enough experience, maybe the web can become something that people invest in. And remember, the web's superpower is its ability to link. Again, Alex Russell, the guy who created the term progressive web app. And URL sharing is what enabled the web to spread and prosper, and he calls it the web's superpower, and that's why I'm calling it the superpower, because I totally agree. Deep linking is the power. You can create content rapidly and get an index rapidly for what I've said with these long tail keywords, which is, if you know enough about search engine marketing, long tail keywords are over 80% of the search phrases every day in the search engines. So let's go back to our graph. We've talked about how the web now has the ability for you to craft things that are more platform integrated, which means they have more capabilities. But the web retains its ability for deep linking and reach. But native applications haven't gained that ability. And that means that the web is essentially on par capability-wise with those native applications, but is still the big winner when it comes to reach. Now that means that the web is the clear winner when it comes to the app smackdown. And this is the big reason why you really should start investing heavily into progressive web applications. Now we're going to keep looking at progressive web apps and more details about them, and hopefully you're going to enjoy this and share it. But remember, if you want to learn more about programming progressive web apps, we've got a great course called Progressive Web App from Beginner to Expert, and I encourage you to visit pwacourse.com so that you can get the best deal on our progressive web application course available. Okay, we've looked at the app Smackdown, and we've established progressive web apps as a clear winner over native applications these days. So let's dive a little deeper into the advantages progressive web apps have over native applications. We've talked about better reach. They're linkable, and you can easily share content via deep links, and you don't require this complex installation step before you can get to that deep content. In fact, native applications mean you have to launch the application, go to the default home screen, and then try to navigate your way to the information you were actually looking for. Whereas a link that you share can go directly to the content on your progressive web application. Next is they're very discoverable. One of the big complaints that we have about app stores is the search sucks. They're just not optimized for search. It's really hard to get your content ranked. Whereas search engines have an established criteria to rank web pages. In fact, if you do enough research in SEO, you'll find out that Google has over 200 independent ranking factors, with three very key ranking factors. One primarily is external links to your actual page, and how important are those links, how contextually relevant are those links, all these kind of factors. But you've also got things like RankBrain, which is machine learning. It's a very sophisticated strategy for ranking web pages. And like I said, there are like 3 billion different searches done every day, and about 80% of those are unique, and 15% every day are brand new searches that the search engine hasn't seen before. So this is very interesting, very exciting. But the web has a very mature way to find content and find the right content deep inside of your site. Native apps, it's just not happening. Progressive web apps are cross-platform. They work progressively, even if the platform or the browser doesn't support some of the features like service workers, no problem. As long as you've crafted using web development best practices, your site's going to work well on every single browser. They're also responsive, which means you can build one code base and you craft it using CSS media queries, and often like frameworks like Bootstrap help take care of this kind of stuff for you, so that now your website will work on any device, any screen resolution, and work more or less back to where we were 10 years ago, where we didn't have to worry about those screen resolutions quite as much. Granted, you still need to test on different screen sizes just to make sure things work, but we've kind of got the science part of it worked out, and we've got things like well-known breakpoints and grid layouts, and things like CSS Grid and Flexbox make this experience much easier for us to manage as developers and designers. But the big thing is it's cross-platform. You don't have to maintain 3, 4 different native applications to hit the different device platforms. You have one code base that can reach everything, and that is a very key advantage when it comes to return on investment and how many resources you have to throw at building interfaces for customers. The web has a much simpler installation process. It's just freaking installable. We've had the ability to do favorites. We've had the ability to bookmark things. We've had the ability to add things to the desktop, pin them to the taskbar, even pin them to the start menu. And that's just getting better and better. Now the browsers are starting to integrate native stuff if you meet the criteria required. What are those criteria? Well, be served over HTTPS. Have a valid web manifest file with the icons that are needed. And I've got a video and blog post on what your baseline icons for your progressive web app need to be. I'll give you a hint. You need 17 images. But I've got a trick in there so you don't have to worry about making 17 images. I got a trick to make those for you. Anyway, the browsers will prompt you. There's no app store needed. Unless you're on Windows and you want that deep platform integration, there's really no need for you to have to worry about that. Most browsers will actually trigger a thing, but you could also do it yourself if you really wanted to. And so that makes your application, your web application, your progressive web application, much more findable and indicates that deep customer relationship. Now, again, increased engagement. Progressive web apps are app-like, they're fresh, re-engageable, and basically that means they're just always up to date because we've got an instant deploy. If you've got a continuous deploy process, you can update stuff thousands of times a day. That's what GitHub does. Did you know they update their website on average 1,000 times a day? And they've got this continual deploy process that's constantly building things as their developers check in little tiny changes into their production branch. And we talk about re-engagement. That's because you got things like push notifications that allow you to drive interactions directly from the platform without the user even being on your website. And in the future, I could foresee things like geofencing and that whole um, Minority Report experience where you walk in the store and it says, "Hey, welcome, Mr. Smith. Would you like to look at some jeans?" Hey, we can do that through things like service workers in the near future because we're already looking at uh, things like geofencing capabilities. And if you're not familiar with geofencing, that's what you saw in Minority Report when he walked into the Gap. And we're on the cusp of making that real with the web. So at this point, you're like, man, Chris, these progressive web apps, this is the path we need to go on. This is totally right for us. This is totally right for everybody, right? But the reality is, what platforms and browsers support progressive web applications? And I got great news there. Basically, all of them are excited about progressive web apps. Chrome obviously is the lead champion because they're the team that coined the term progressive web apps. They're the ones that started crafting the service worker specification, and they're obviously the first one to implement a lot of these features. But Opera and Firefox are right alongside of them. The Microsoft Edge team has supported and promoted the concept of a hosted web app since Windows 10 was released, which is now over 2 years ago. And basically, a hosted web app is a progressive web app without the service worker. And then you've been able to submit those to the Microsoft Store for a long time. In fact, a lot of very popular apps in the Microsoft Store are hosted web apps, which basically means they're progressive web apps for the most part. And another one is Samsung. Samsung is one of the most popular devices today. The Galaxy and Note series are some of the best selling mobile phones out there. And over the last couple of years, they have developed a fantastic browser called Samsung Internet, and it has supported progressive web apps as well. Now, each one of these platforms implements things like the add to home screen experience slightly different, and that's okay. Uh, and that's also good because we get a little variety of kind of what works best out there, but for the most part, they all support that. Now, at the moment, Microsoft Edge has not shipped public support for service workers, but they have shipped it in their insider preview. So hopefully by the release of, I think it's Redstone 4 is what it's called, basically the spring 2018 release, which could turn into the summer 2018 release. There's no guarantee what day it's going to ship. The average Windows user will have service worker support on their in through Microsoft Edge, which gives you basically everything on Windows will support full progressive web app capabilities at that point. But this leads to the big question, what about Apple and what about progressive web apps on iOS? The good news is many of the features can be polyfilled, and honestly, I've been doing this since about 2010. When I first started having to build mobile first web experiences, I learned really quickly that I had to adjust the architecture of building my websites. And the good news is that architecture I chose and crafted is basically a progressive web application. I found ways to cache and persist my assets and content and data offline using local storage at the time, and those patterns still work. And I was using app cache at the time, and that still works. Now, progressive web apps, because they're progressive, still work on iOS, and they're going to perform better on iOS than a traditional website, and that's because you have implemented web development best practices. But the best news and the best signal we have is that Apple has started development on service workers. We don't know when they're going to land. They're never public with what they're doing necessarily, but for this one, they did actually tweet out some stuff that let us know that they're actually working on it, and they tripped the actively working on it bit on their status page of features. So we know that Apple is actually implementing service workers. We have no clue if they're going to adopt the add to home screen capabilities or not, but knowing that they'll support service workers is 90% of that battle anyway, which means in the near future, we're going to have ubiquitous service worker support across all the platforms, which is so awesome. Now here's some stats if you don't believe me. The AliExpress, which is a major e-commerce retailing platform similar to Amazon, saw an 82% increase in iOS conversions after changing to a progressive web app. And that's because their experience just worked better. The Washington Post has seen a near 5 times increase in user engagement. That means that people are actually reading the Washington Post 5 times more than they were before it became a progressive web application. In fact, let's compare the difference between the progressive web app Washington Post and the regular Washington Post. You're looking at under a second on average versus 3.3 seconds is what they clocked as the average load time. Now, I'll be quite honest, I seriously doubt they were getting 3.3 seconds. I believe it's probably worse because there's no news site that loads that fast even on desktop because they're so polluted with so many third-party scripts. But because they followed better web development practices, and they were able to clean up their load time to under a second. But they're not the only one. Forbes.com, the Weather Channel, and now Twitter and many other thousands of companies are experiencing similar numbers and interactions of customer engagement increasing because they've adopted progressive web applications. And if you're wondering about actual users, this graphic comes from an infographic the Chrome team released about 3 years ago, where they said that they had 1 billion active users a month. But here's the reality. That's old. Today, you're looking at over 2.5 billion users use browsers that support progressive web apps, and then once Edge ships service worker support, we're going to top 3 billion active daily users that have progressive web app support in their hands or their desktops. So this is great news. That means we've got a massive market to serve with progressive web applications. So now we've established that we've got great browser enthusiasm behind progressive web apps, and we've got a massive potential user base of progressive web apps. And I've already mentioned some great wins for progressive web apps that have been reported from companies. Let's go look at a few of those companies and what they've been reporting in some of the case studies around progressive web applications. And most notably, one of the first things that the Chrome team loves to point out is Flipkart. If you're not familiar with Flipkart, this is like Amazon in India. So they've got different challenges than Amazon has here in the Western world. They've got a lot of users that are on poor cellular services and on lower powered mobile devices. And a native application just really wasn't working well for them because there's just not enough power and space on those devices, much less the cellular connectivity. So what they did was they decided to adopt a progressive web application approach, and they saw fantastic returns. And they're one of the first adopters of progressive web applications. So this tells you even when progressive web apps were not really truly fleshed out yet, Flipkart was able to take advantage and turn that into a massive positive win. And so they've reported, and these stats are a little bit old at this point, I think, but they've started seeing 3 times more time spent on their site by customers. And whenever you got people spending more and more time on your site, the more likely they are to convert to actually paying customers, and that's a good thing. They also saw a 40% higher re-engagement statistics. And if you're not familiar with sales funnels and stuff, re-engagement is very key to driving actual sales because the more times people come to your site, the more likely they are to purchase from you. And like we see here, they had a 70% greater conversion from the home screen. So when people add that icon to the home screen, they're much more likely to buy from you or convert however you need them to convert. But here's another big stat that I love to see. 3 times lower data usage. That means they had a third of the actual bandwidth needs that they had before. That is huge. Most native applications and websites use way more bandwidth than they actually need to make their experience work. So one of the things that they did that I really like is they created a great onboarding experience to kind of guide their customers through the progressive web application experience, and that ultimately leads to a higher add to home screen rate. So if you know what essentially an onboarding process is, they've done a good job with that, and there's resources out there to kind of show you what they've done with their onboarding experience, and I encourage you to go out there and investigate that more. And just for an example, when you first get to the Flipkart site, they've got a little thing to actually drive the add to home screen experience. They've got a little button up there. And as you go through it, they'll even show you how to add, they walk you through the add to home screen experience so that you know exactly how to do it manually, even if the browser hasn't prompted you yet to add it to the home screen. Now, another great example is Alibaba, another Asian-based company, again, a major online e-commerce retailer. And so they wanted to obviously increase sales and attract more potential customers. And that's exactly what they did. They saw a 76% increase in conversions and an increase in active monthly users. But look at this. They added 14% more iOS users, which I think in China is a huge deal because iPhones are a lot more expensive per capita there than they are here. And I think they're rarer to find as well. But they also saw a 30% increase in customers and engagements or whatever their metrics are on Android. So both platforms saw a major increase in customer engagements. Now another Indian company is housing.com. And this is sort of like Airbnb and hotels.com or Priceline.com kind of merged together. And basically they're a real estate company. Maybe they're more like a Zillow or something. I'm not totally sure. But anyway, they wanted to acquire more users and enhance their website quality by adopting a progressive web app. And what they reported is, again, an increase in conversions, fewer people leaving the site on what we call a bounce rate, and the longer average session, which means, again, spending more time on the site. But one of the things they reported that's really positive, a 30% faster page load. That's a very key thing too. So if you're not sold on progressive web apps yet as the path you need to take, I'm not totally sure what's going to take to get you there. But progressive web apps are changing the way we look at the web, and everybody who has been adopting progressive web apps and putting them in production have been reporting great returns. Now that doesn't mean that everything about progressive web apps is super easy to do. There are three key technical requirements. The first is upgrading to be HTTPS, and there's a lot more to it than just installing an SSL certificate. You also need a good, valid web manifest file with those icons that I mentioned earlier. And you need to have a service worker that handles the fetch event to offer offline caching capabilities. And this is where things can get super complex really quick. And this is why I have created the Progressive Web Application from Beginner to Expert course. Again, visit pwacourse.com. Right now, there's about 20 hours of online training available to you, and I'm only adding more and more every week. So I don't want you to be left out. I want to encourage you to go register for that and dive into it. But hopefully this video has been very useful to help you know what progressive web apps are and why you should use progressive web apps, so that if you're struggling to sell your team on them or your stakeholders, either share this video with them or take the points directly from here and build your own report. And if you need a little help, I've got a little book called Why Upgrade to a Progressive Web App. And if you go to lovetodev.com/PWA upgrade, you can enter in your email address and I'll send you the information to download that ebook. Thanks a lot, and hopefully this has been very helpful to you.
So I hope you enjoyed this presentation and that now you understand the benefits of a progressive web app and are maybe reconsidering possibly doing a native app. Progressive web applications give you all kinds of great ways to engage customers at lower cost. And the great thing is you can upgrade any existing website to a progressive web application relatively easily. Now, we would love to talk to you about any needs you might have or questions you may have around progressive web applications and help you start your journey to be a progressive web application on the internet. If you're a developer, we've got a brand new course called Progressive Web Applications from Beginner to Expert, where I'm going to teach you all the things you need to know to program great progressive web application experiences. We're going to cover a lot of things about service workers. We're going to go through lifecycle. We're going to go through a lot of detail on service worker caching. I'm going to show you how to implement push notifications and much, much more. So click the link in the description below and you'll get the lowest price available. This course normally costs $200, but the link in the description below, you can enroll right now for just $29 and save yourself $171. And this is great because you can take the course anywhere you are, anytime you want, and you can learn progressive web apps at your own pace. Now, if you've got any questions about progressive web apps, service workers, or anything about the web versus the native experience, please feel free to leave some questions in the comments below, and I will definitely like to engage you on that. Or visit our website, lovetodev.com, and hit us up there through the contact form, or hit me up on Twitter, @ChrisLove. I'm active on Twitter all the time, and I'd love to hear from you there. But again, if you like the video, hit that like button. If you think it would benefit one of your friends or many of your friends, share it with them as well. I'd love to reach out to them and help spread the word about progressive web applications. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because I've got all kinds of great progressive web app and other web related content that you're going to not want to miss.